Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. Just because something is popular doesn't mean that it will be able to withstand the test of time and appeal to future generations. That's a truth that theater fans, or really anyone who cares about the arts, knows all too well. One of those massive box office successes that has since faded away into obscurity is Abie's Irish Rose, a play that premiered in 1922 and was reviled by critics, even as it became the longest-running show in Broadway history up to that time. Today we're joined by Eric Grode, who wrote about Abie's Irish Rose in the New York Times for the centenary of its Broadway premiere. Eric is the director of the Goldring Arts Journalism and Communications program at Syracuse University and is a regular freelance critic and reporter for the Times. He's also the author of The Book of Broadway, The Definitive Plays and Musicals, which included a chapter on Abie's Irish Rose, as well as the book Hair, the story of the show that defined a generation. Eric, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's start by talking about Abie's Irish Rose itself. What's this play about, and what was its run on Broadway like?
Well, so what it was about, stop me if you've heard this before. The plot is a nice Jewish boy who meets a nice Catholic girl. They fall in love. The parents are led to think that each of them is marrying within their own faith, and they all kind of converge for the wedding. They find out, and hilarity ensues. I mean, that's basically what happens. It's a very broad culture clash comedy. And what it's run on Broadway was like, it was unprecedentedly long. As I think most of your listeners know, Broadway runs used to be far, far shorter than they are these days. But the previous record holder was a play in the late 1910s called Lightning. It was this comic melodrama. It had just closed when Abie's opened in 1922, and Abie's ended up coming close to doubling that run. It was by a wide margin the most popular play of its time.
Do you have any sense of who was coming to see the show? I mean, given how long it ran, there must have been a whole bunch of people and maybe some repeat viewers. Who was coming to see this and turning it into such a smash hit?
Well, the repeat viewers is an interesting point. The advertising at the time, there were some people who had a bit of name recognition in the cast from time to time. They really weren't alluded to in the ads. There weren't a lot of pull quotes from rave reviews, which I imagine we'll talk about because there weren't that many rave reviews. The longevity quickly became what was discussed. The selling point was, the longest running Broadway play. One man has seen Abie 31 times. That's a line that came at this point. So that was what they had to work with. So that's what they worked with. There's a lot that we don't know about Abie. There's a lot of lore about the show and about its creator, Ann Nichols. Not all of it can be verified, especially a lot on Nichols has that sort of fan magazine supplied by a publicist kind of sense to it. But we do know that Abie's was an early and frequent site at LeBlanc's ticket office. This was a precursor to TKTS, and it ran out of the basement of this drugstore in Times Square. They sold full price tickets on the ground floor and cut price tickets in the basement. And so Abie's Irish Rose got in there early. So we know that it was discounted early and often before that was nearly as common a practice. It also made a point of going to its audience. So because of these broad Jewish and Irish Catholic stereotypes in the show, they really catered to those audiences. There was this famous life-size diorama that depicted the wedding scene, and it was plunked down, it was on Grand Concourse, and I can't remember the cross street, but in the Bronx, in a heavily, heavily Jewish area of the Bronx. So I mean, it was again, because the reviews weren't necessarily what they might have hoped, there was a lot of kind of doing an end run around that and going directly to the prospective ticket buyers.
That's so interesting that you say, in particular, leaning into potential Jewish or Irish American audiences, which you would maybe from our 21st century perspective doesn't make a lot of sense. We tend to think, if somebody is stereotyped in a show, that generally would make it problematic for them. Do you get any sense of how that sort of use of stereotype worked with those people who came to see the show?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in the early 20th century, I get the impression that certainly one of those groups, and probably both of those groups, it almost became, I don't want to say a badge of honor, but it became a testament to how thick-skinned you were at that point, that you had achieved enough of a level of stability or prominence or comfort that you could kind of handle the humor coming your way. George M. Cohan, not on the same time, sometimes trafficked in Irish stereotypes as well, and crowds flock to those. So this changed over time, so because Abie's ran for so long, and there were subsequent iterations, there were 2 film versions, there was a radio version. I do know that the one of the film versions came out in 1946. So this is immediately in the wake of World War II. Then and only then did groups like the Anti-Defamation League actually weigh in and saying, this isn't funny anymore. We're not comfortable with that. So its reception shifted over time. But at the time, I haven't found much of people, been out of shape or upset at these stereotypes. And these are broad stereotypes in the show, but they seem to play in 1922 and 23 and 24 and 25. It ran for quite some time.
So you were summarizing the plot a moment ago, and you started off saying, stop me if you've heard this before. And there's this telling anecdote in your Times story about a quote unquote knockoff production of this play, got sued for copying Abie's Irish Rose. Could you tell us a little bit more about what happened with that and maybe what it tells us about the style and content of the original play?
Sure. And I think the key words in what you just said were knockoff, but also original, because that really was at the core of this court case. The other production in question was not a stage production, but a film in 1926 called The Cohens and Kellys. I mean, Abie's might as well have been called The Levies and Murphys. I mean, it was a very, very similar. Ann Nichols, was not wrong to feel like this is awfully close to, a property that is a very popular property that she stands to gain financially from. So she sued. And the ruling came down to Nichols lost. And the idea was, let's be honest here, it's hard to lay claim to characters and situations that have been around for a long, long time. I mean, these are things that weren't unfamiliar to people who were watching Moliere or Plautus, they're stock characters and stock situations. And so the judge in that case basically said, nobody's knocking anybody off here, or at least nobody's knocking anything off that hasn't been knocked off already. By the way, I should probably mention, I said that earlier that there wasn't much out there about the show and about Ann Nichols. There is one noted exception to that. A scholar named Jordan Schildkraut, who wrote this terrific book called In the Long Run about hit Broadway shows. He was a source in the story I wrote and a great resource. And he actually is deeply knowledgeable about this material.
So we talked about the stereotypes in the play. And one of the features of your article, you do talk to a couple of companies in New York that are, largely dedicated to reviving forgotten plays. The general sense I got was that none of them will be bringing back Abie's Irish Rose anytime soon. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about that and why?
Yeah, I was eager to see, as I was doing some research, the production history in New York City is very, very scant for the last several decades. There have been a little sort of stock productions or almost community theater type productions. And so I reached out to, the theaters that jump to mind would be like the Neighborhood Playhouse, Irish Rep, the Mint. All 3 of them have had a lot of success kind of resuscitating plays from this period that they feel warrant another viewing. In each case, all 3 of them, their answers were sort of like, we are aware of this play's existence. Yes. There was just, I don't see any of them doing it anytime soon. I mean, time has not been kind to a lot of these stock characters and situations. I mean, they are rampant examples of, some pretty pernicious stereotypes. I mean, I think about things like Encores, which takes these great classic musicals that have really questionable books and basically rewrites or chucks everything they need to from the books to get to the good music. Abie's Irish Rose is kind of like all book and no score from one of those kinds of, broad comedies and stuff that it doesn't get done much these days. You are right.
As much as the play itself might not be something that anyone's eager to revive these days, the playwright behind it, Ann Nichols, sounds pretty interesting. Could you tell us a little bit more about her and how she got this to Broadway?
Sure. And actually, I had thought, so I pitched this article to my editors at the Times, not knowing exactly where the story was going to go, which happens sometimes. Sometimes it's obvious, oh, we got to write about this because of X or Y. Usually it's topicality or a new production's opening. Here was this, the centennial, which is interesting, but also, then what? And at the time, I was thinking this idea that, the most popular play of the 1920s was written by a female playwright, Ann Nichols. I'm like, that seems intriguing and probably worth pursuing. What I learned along the way is if you look at the 1920s and the 50 or so biggest shows from that period, almost 30% of them were written by women. So gender parity was far, far closer on Broadway then. I haven't done all the research, but I'm hard pressed to think of times, if any, where it has been that close in recent decades. So the fact that she was a woman playwright was and is noteworthy, but not as much as I thought, because it wasn't that anomalous at the time. So as I did a little more research, like I said, a lot of it you have to take with kind of a grain of salt, but we do know that she was born in Dales Mill, Georgia, a tiny town in Georgia, moved to New York City by herself. She was a Baptist who married a Catholic and apparently drew upon the experiences from that for the play. She got the play produced in Los Angeles, and it was not nearly as popular as it later became, but ran for weeks and weeks and weeks, and seemed like a logical move to New York. If you believe what you see out there, no one was willing to take a chance on it. Those producers declined to move it to New York, at which point she did this thing that everyone says is the biggest no-no, and she put her own money into the show. Don't tell Max Bialystock, but she supposedly pawned her jewelry and, scraped together $5,000, which is what it took to get it up and running. And crucially, because she didn't have outside backers, or at least many outside backers, the success of the show accrued directly to her. She was, for all intents and purposes, its sole backer, from what I can tell. So her fortunes were very closely tied to the show and its success. So she did write some other things, but the vast majority of her time in the intervening years, and with less and less success, decades beyond that, was to just kind of be the steward of this property, seeing it through the radio version, which ran for a few years, through the 2 film versions, through the tours that ran for a long, long time. It had a comparably record-setting and then breaking lengthy time on the road. And she was very mindful of how all of those things were coming along. She kept a very close eye on the property. Understandably, it was hers, and it was her meal ticket. So that was something that Abie's Irish Rose kind of became her career for a while.
So the critical reaction to Abie's Irish Rose, as we've hinted a bit, not quite the same as its popular reception. You in particular in your article single out Robert Benchley of the Algonquin Round Table. He had all these wonderful pointed one-liners disparaging the show. Who was Benchley? Why does his disdain for the play matter?
Well, as you point out, it wasn't just his disdain, but Benchley's is the one that has stuck around in popular memory for a couple reasons. The Round Table wasn't known for its politesse. It had a reputation for having these really acid-tongued members who would, slice down whoever wasn't in the room at the time, sometimes even the people who were in the room at the time. And it was kind of a blood sport. It was competitive to see who could have the sharpest knives. Dorothy Parker sort of looms in our mind as the sort of reigning champion on that front. Alexander Wolcott had a fairly wicked streak. Benchley, that wasn't his thing usually. He was more kind of wry and gentle and perplexed. He wasn't playing that game to nearly the extent as some of the other people at the Round Table, basically with the exception of Abie's Irish Rose. He was the editor of the theater, the sort of the front of the book in Life magazine, which had long-running shows. You see this in Time Out or publications these days. The new stuff you review at some length, and you just have these little capsule reviews for things that are still running and still running and still running. And so because Abie stuck around for so long, almost 5 years, he just went after this show week after week after week. And it clearly became a game, like just can you top last week or the weeks before? And he's got all these great lines. I mean, I cite some, but only some of them in my article, and space is tight. So, he's got all right if you never went beyond the fourth grade, or the comic spirit of 1876. Will the Marines never come? I mean, he just came, finally had a contest to see, who wants to come in and take a week bashing Abie's Irish Rose. Harpo Marx won that contest, And I mentioned before that the producers of Abie's Irish Rose really didn't do a lot in the way of pull quotes. I found this kind of delicious. One of his Life magazine capsules along the way was just 2 sentences. America's favorite comedy, period. God forbid, period. So the producers took the first 3 words of that and plastered it in the lobby and just skipped the God forbid part. So, yeah, I mean, there was a lot of sport to be had at poking at Abie's Irish Rose. But the one that jumps out to me when I was reporting it was that he said, people laugh at this every night, which explains why a democracy can never be a success. It's a funny line. It's a good line, but it also starts to peel back the curtain a little bit. I'm always wary, like anyone historian or scholar, it's always risky to call anything the first of anything or the most or because there's so often you can be found, no, you missed this one from before. So I'm not going to say this is the first time or the biggest, earliest example, but it's certainly among the first cases where the critics, the gatekeepers and tastemakers said to do one thing and the audience just didn't listen. The audience went ahead and flocked to this show. And I don't think that sat very well with said gatekeepers and tastemakers. I mean, I think they're sort of saying, how dare you? We told you this isn't worth your time, and yet you're going. And so now the gloves come off a little bit, and they start to rip into the show, but also sometimes kind of obliquely and indirectly, and sometimes, as you heard there, not so obliquely, what is wrong with this show and what is wrong with these people for liking this show. And so that's something that I found as I was researching Abie's Irish Rose, that jumped out to me as like that chasm between critical and popular opinion seemed worth exploring and talking about a bit.
Yeah, this is, particularly, I'm sure interesting for you because, you teach students about criticism. I'm wondering in researching this and then kind of comparing it to what you're doing, do you see similar dynamics reflected today in the theater or even pop culture at large? And how do you think about those dynamics? How do you think about what you see with Benchley and Abie's Irish Rose in connection with your work as a teacher?
Sure. And it very much came. I mean, I remember I talked about it with my students when the Oscars had happened and they'd added those, as we saw it, sort of pandering audience favorite moments or these great things, what they finally showed. I can't remember, like the Flash entering the super fast zone or whatever. I believe
it was the speed zone.
The speed zone, the super speed zone. That was, the greatest, and that whole came to exist because there was this perceived gap between what the people want to see honored and what the critics or the critical establishment or this sort of bifurcated notion of if it's popular. This whole idea of can 12 million Elvis fans be right or whatever, when sometimes you feel like the critics are saying, well, if there's 12 million of them, then they can't be right. There has to be some kind of disconnect. And you see in the case of Abie's Irish Rose, what's the opposite of a backlash, a frontlash? After it had been being torn apart for so long, Wolcott, that critic who I mentioned, finally got to it well into its run. He was out of town, out of the country, I think, when Abie's opened. And as he wrote at the time, he came to New York and all these people were saying Abie's Irish Rose is the worst thing ever. Why would you even think of going to see it? He then claims to have ascertained that none of those people had actually seen the show. They were just sort of saying what was received wisdom at that point. And then he went and he didn't think it was very good, but he didn't quite understand what the pylon was about. And he also came to the similar conclusion that it might have something to do with the fact that everyone else seems to like it so much. I think there was, this might be apocryphal, but I believe it was about Man of La Mancha. And there was a quote from one of the creators or a producer or someone who said that everyone hates this show except the audience, which, starts to raise some serious questions. And we saw it with Cats, and we see it with, I don't know, Mamma Mia or Wicked. Most of these shows will have, some favorable reviews, but oftentimes, the critics' top 10 lists and the box office lists are not one and the same in almost any medium. And so with my students, I find sometimes they have reviews that fixate on how the audience felt about something. And I often point out, I'm not that interested in what the audience feels. If I'm reading a review from a critic, regardless of their age, I'm reading it because I think that critic has some insight or some opinions that are worth hearing. And that's who I want to hear from. The only reason I would think that citing the audience around you is pertinent would be if you feel duty bound to point out that this show that you absolutely loathed had, standing ovations on all sides, or the opposite of that. But, if your reaction runs counter to everyone else around you, it might not be a bad idea to point out the fact that yours is, seemingly the decidedly minority opinion in this case. But this concept of does popular equal good? No, probably not. But does popular equal bad? No, of course not. But you wouldn't necessarily know that sometimes from the critical reception for things. And so, that's something that we've actually talked about a fair amount in class.
Even if, like we've been saying, we're not probably going to see Abie's Irish Rose on Broadway anytime soon, but any fan of a classic Broadway musical is probably going to be used to doing that thing where you have to decipher outdated pop culture references in song lyrics. And it seems like Abie's Irish Rose is an especially prominent example of that. Where do references to this show show up in musicals? And what does that say about its enduring legacy, such as that is?
That's a good question. I mean, it's popped up, as you said, a handful of times. Probably the most familiar today would be I'm Still Here, from the Sondheim show Follies. Well, Sondheim and Goldman show Follies, but, we're talking about Sondheim's lyric. And I'm Still Here was one that he wrote. It's a list song, it's a kind of a laundry list of all these different things that this faded showgirl who's been around the block and seen it all. This is, among the many things that she's seen along the way. The song goes more or less sequentially in sort of chronological order. And I'm pretty sure Sondheim wrote that song out of town. Yeah, I think it was in Boston. And one song left for that character, and I'm Still Here came in. It has some very deep cuts in terms of 20th century esoterica, and not just showbiz esoterica, even though she is, a showbiz veteran, but it alludes to like Beebe's bathysphere and Brenda Fraser, and some very ones that really do benefit from a quick Wikipedia search. But so that's probably the most familiar at this point. The first one that I know of, and it's probably the most pointed one, came up while Abie's Irish Rose was still in its original run. Rodgers and Hart wrote for a review. I want to say it was the Garrick Gaieties, I'm not sure. But in 25, they wrote a song called Manhattan, which a lot of people know of as We'll Have Manhattan, but the song is actually called Manhattan. And it's talking about, if we move to New York City, we're going to do all these things and go to Coney Island and go up to Yonkers and all this stuff. And then they say, what is it? Our future babies will take to Abie's Irish Rose. I hope they live to see it close. And so already at that point, and Hart is, Hart would not have been out of place at the Algonquin Round Table for a lot, in a lot of ways. But, there is that sort of edge to it at that point that just sort of take your shots at the big popular punching bag. It's come up since then. Cole Porter mentions it in a 1940 song called Ace in the Hole. I think mostly because he finally has a new rhyme for maybe and baby that he can slip Abie in there. And then Comden and Green, not long after Follies, Comden and Green, there's a song from On the 20th Century, which is another list song. It's like all this sort of detritus from, his long life as a producer, and includes some ticket stubs from Abie's Irish Rose. So those are the ones that jump out to me. But, I think I'm Still Here just because it's such an iconic song. And Manhattan, which is also an iconic song, but also another great example of taking shots at this show any chance you get.
So I'm going to put this as bluntly as possible. Why should anyone care about Abie's Irish Rose today? What lessons can we draw from the history of its very long, successful run?
As I mentioned in the article, if you are looking for the DNA of this show, it's murky in some ways because, like I said, like it's not exactly original. It's hard to say like whence Abie's Irish Rose sprang this play and this play. And I will say that I feel like television sitcoms is probably the most common place to see it. Bridget Loves Bernie, for example, is the most obvious example, but there have been a lot of different interfaith shows. Some have lasted a long time. There was one with Jackie Mason and Lynn Redgrave. I can't remember the name of that one, but it was a mercifully short run, as I recall. But TV has feasted for decades on these kind of broad culture clash stock characters, as it was deemed from that lawsuit. As for theater, so the shows that supplanted Abie's on the list were like Tobacco Road, Life with Father, neither of which are exactly held up as these titans of 20th century theater at this point either. All of them have kind of faded into the distance. In terms of lessons we can draw now, I think, kind of like I was saying, I deal with the Goldring students at Syracuse. Any art form that wants to consider itself a popular art form, and I can't think of too many art forms that don't aspire on some level to be a popular art form. I mean, I think you need to be ready for this idea that popularity is decided by the many, not the few. It's what people choose to pay money to listen to or watch, or that's what's popular. And sometimes that dovetails with what the critics say is really great, and often it doesn't. And I think that can be a bitter pill to swallow for the people who's view their job as guiding people toward the good stuff and away from the bad stuff. So I think more than anything else, I think that's a lesson, that popularity is not necessarily up to us in the critical sphere. That and everyone always loves a good mother-in-law joke. Like those have never there'll always be room for those, apparently.
We'll post a link to Eric's article on Abie's Irish Rose in the New York Times, as well as additional information about the play and its history. You can find all of that in our show notes. Eric, thank you for introducing us to this important piece of theatrical and pop culture history.
It was my pleasure. I'm really glad to have been on the show. Thanks for having me.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit theaterhistorypodcast.net and follow @theaterhistory on Twitter. Just a note, theater is spelled THEATRE in our website URL, and it's spelled TER at the end in our Twitter handle. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.